So it's only episode 1, but I have already lied to you all. I labelled myself as a Steely Dan superfan in my introduction, and yeah, I have to come clean. I really don't know all that much about their work before Steely Dan. And to be fair, it isn't entirely my fault. When putting together this video, I was reminded of why I had abandoned this project in the past. The sheer abundance and variety of songs to sift through can get a bit overwhelming. The first 5 years of Fagen and Becker's partnership was spent playing and writing music in a variety of different capacities. They were part-time musicians in bands, wrote songs that were recorded by other artists, and by 1971 had managed to make enough of a name for themselves that they were commissioned to write the soundtrack to the smash hit 1971 comedy You Gotta Walk It Like You Talk It or You'll Lose That Beat. It was a busy 5 years, and the result of it all is probably the hardest period in their history to research and definitively understand. And for the longest time, this didn't just stop me from making these videos, it halted my exploration of this era of the band altogether. Maybe it's my neurosis, but I always felt overwhelmed by the idea of delving into this era of the band without doing my research. I didn't want to explore, let alone write about, something I felt I didn't properly understand. In actuality though, this era is less daunting than it may seem at first glance, at least for the purposes of what I'm doing. For a start, whilst there are a lot of different bootleg releases of the demos out there, most of them are just repackaged versions of the already existing tracks, with the added bonuses of seemingly random omissions that vary from release to release, and sound quality that is so poor even I notice it. For the other tracks from this era, I mostly found that everything I didn't already know about was on the Steely Dan database or was sent to me by helpful people in the community. There is a lot more to it than merely the songs that have recordings, but I can only really talk about music that exists, and for the sake of keeping the length of this already bloated video down, I will only be looking at songs Fagen and Becker wrote which have an existing performance. For a more nuanced look at their lost media, I recommend everyone watch the video by Dingus on the topic. I highly recommend all his videos, but this one in particular. I'll link his video as well as my sources and other recommendations in the description of this one. Please check them out if you have a keen interest in the lost work of Steely Dan. But I'm rambling, and I have 53 songs to cover in this video. So, without further ado, let's look at the music of the pre-Dan era. Having met at Bard College in 1967, Fagen and Becker spent their college years performing with a variety of bands, including one which had Chevy Chase on drums in what has become the most well-known little-known fact in Steely Dan history. While in these bands, Fagen and Becker also began writing music together, which, as would become tradition throughout their career, was often a bit much for their bandmates to handle. Unfortunately, no recordings from this period exist, and the Fagen-Becker compositions from this era have been lost to time. The pre-Dan era becomes a bit more interesting in the years after Fagen and Becker left Bard and moved to New York City. It was 1969 when the two scruffy, long-haired derelicts wandered into the offices of Jata Enterprises while looking for work in the Brill building. Jata was a publishing and production company formed by the members of the pop rock group Jay and the Americans, following a decline in their success after pop rock music actually became interesting in the back half of the 1960s. Luckily for them, Jata member Kenny Vance obliged to hear them out, despite a distinct lack of vibe. Vibe or not, Vance immediately saw something in Fagen and Becker's material. He became their manager, and they started putting together demos in an attempt to get a record deal and form a band around their music. This was unsuccessful, but Fagen and Becker were able to sell some of their tracks to other artists during this time. In 1970, Fagen and Becker responded to a Village Voice advertisement reading "Bass and keyboard player required, must have jazz chops, no arseholes need apply." Deciding 2 out of 3 was close enough, Fagen and Becker applied and got a job playing with the band Demian. It was here they met Dinny Diaz, alongside vocalist Keith Thomas. The drummer Mark Leon left shortly after Fagen and Becker joined, and was replaced by John DiCepolo, who Fagen and Becker had met while touring with Jay and the Americans. As far as I can tell, Thomas and DiCepolo both shortly afterwards retreated from the music industry. Alongside touring with Jay and the Americans, the duo spent the next little while recording their demos with Demian and making the aforementioned soundtrack. What came after that is a topic for the next video, but that is a brief overview that covers the basic information needed to delve into the demos themselves. On screen now is a list of every pre-Dan demo with an existing recording, comprising 34 tracks in total, which were recorded between the years of 1969 and 1971. Of them, there are 6 which would be eventually recorded by Fagen and Becker on Steely Dan albums, and 28 which wouldn't. To my mind, it makes sense to separate the 6 songs that eventually received official Steely Dan recordings. Although these songs were recorded alongside the other demos, their eventual adaptation and inclusion on an official Steely Dan release means they have a unique characteristic that I think separates them from the others. Also, it just helps to break things down when you have 53 songs to cover. The 6 tracks in question are Brooklyn, later renamed Brooklyn Owes the Charm Under Me, Barrytown, Parker's Band, Charlie Freak, Any World That I'm Welcome To, and The Caves of Altamira. So let's look at these first. I'm going to talk about these demos removed from what I think of the eventual official release. I wouldn't want to spoil any future videos, because I'm sure my thoughts on these songs are the equivalent of the ending of The Sopranos for all of you. Seeing as David Palmer's lead vocals are something I always found a little difficult to get into on Can't Buy a Thrill, the concept of a Fagen-led version of one of these songs is definitely interesting to me. And whilst I don't think this is a perfect rendition of the song that fixes all of my issues with the album version, far from it, I think it stands on its own pretty well, especially for something only designed to be a demo. This version of the track definitely leans into a more down-tempo Dylan-esque aesthetic, and Fagen manages to slide in well vocally without it feeling like an imitation. Instrumentally, it's a pretty high quality demo, complete with an organ track and an appearance from guitarist Elliot Randall, who played the solo on Reelin in the Years and a few other Steely Dan tracks. The organ is an awesome inclusion that really fits the vibe of this recording, and Randall's guitar is great too. I can definitely see why they brought him back in later years. Fagen's vocals suit this version of the song pretty well too, although I think they ultimately made the right choice in selecting Palmer for the updated version they went with on Thrill. It isn't my favourite of these demos. I know enough about structuring video essays to not put my favourite first in a list this long, but it does reshape my perspective on the final song. I mean, it made me appreciate David Palmer's vocal performance a bit more, and that means something coming from me. Whereas the Brooklyn demo felt almost like a complete rendition of the final product, this early iteration of Barrytown is a far simpler affair, featuring just Fagen sitting at a piano. And whilst that means there is a lot less to dig into, it is still enjoyable in its own right. It's a notably more gentle, contemplative recording of the song. Fagen hasn't quite leaned into his naturally nasally, sarcastic vocal style just yet. But although this is far from unpleasant to listen to, it doesn't quite fit the deeply sardonic lyrical content, and feels more like a thematic disconnect than a sarcastic juxtaposition such as the one Fagen and Becker would use on the final track, and indeed many other Steely Dan songs. So although less complex than the Brooklyn demo, it is alike in how it accentuates what works about the final version. Between this and the Barrytown demo, I think this simplistic style actually suits these songs that would eventually appear on Pretzel Logic quite well. Fagen isn't alone on this one, as he is joined by Kenny Vance playing a simple drum track and the notable addition of Becker on backing vocals. Although he doesn't contribute anything major, it is cool to hear him on a track this early in the Dan timeline. Beyond this, it also has some fun piano licks and vocal ad-libs from Fagen that didn't make it onto the final version. Although it is ultimately ridiculous to criticise a demo for feeling incomplete or unpolished, when analysing this track on its own terms it definitely feels more unfinished than the last two, but has enough of interest to still be worth a look for Dan fans. Another one I feel isn't particularly special as a standalone track, but none of these are without their charms. Musically, this is led by Fagen on piano again, but with another appearance from Becker to liven things up a bit. Fagen's piano has a distinctly heavier and more bluesy feel in certain passages, but during others the lack of a full band is definitely felt on this track more than others. I think that this track just feels a bit too sparse without more instruments in a way Barrytown doesn't, but for the Becker vocals and historical context alone this is definitely worth checking out. The demo of Any World is a weird one. A number of elements of this song drastically changed by the Katie Lied sessions, and I think the alterations were mostly for the best. The keyboard Fagen plays here is a bit gimmicky, and I feel that a real piano fits this song a bit better. Becker appears here too, but it's not his best contribution, as I think that he and Fagen's vocals don't mesh too well on this one, and the call and response shouts are a bit lame. Unlike some of the others, this version of the song doesn't feel especially sparse without a full band, but it feels more incomplete conceptually than performatively. The Caves of Altamira is definitely my favourite of the 6 Steely Dan songs that have demos from this era, and I was surprised when I found out it had been written this early. That being said, this is also probably the track that underwent the biggest changes when it was dressed up for its eventual appearance on the Royal Scam. Outside of maybe Brooklyn, this is also my favourite of these 6 demos too. The song definitely feels more incomplete without the epic horn section of its album counterpart, but this version featuring just Fagen playing some dramatic chords at his piano captures the spirit of the final song better than I would have expected. It definitely isn't perfect, but having the foundation of such a great song and maintaining in some capacity a certain level of what makes that song special definitely elevates it beyond more than just a throwaway demo. Also, Becker is on backing vocals, so it's automatically the greatest song ever recorded. These 6 tracks on their own are a cool insight into the early days of Fagen and Becker's partnership, and showcase unique takes on these songs we all know and love that, even though not perfect in their own right, at least provide a cool piece of history to a familiar track. But the meat of these pre-Dan years lies in the songs that never got officially recorded, so let's turn our attention to those. Immediately, the difference between the songs Fagen and Becker later included on their work as Steely Dan and the tracks they left behind is clear. This isn't a judgment on the quality of these songs, but more just a stylistic difference. In this case, the most obvious reason for this is the lead vocals by Keith Thomas, who I quite like but sounds absolutely nothing like the sort of vocalist that would be suited to a Steely Dan track. But on its own, this is a pretty cool song. Thomas's vocals may not fit the vibe of Steely Dan, but they do definitely fit the vibe of this track. Alongside him are Fagen, Becker, Diaz and DiCepolo playing their usual instruments. While I don't mind the more simple setups on earlier songs, I think this track benefits from a slightly more complete rendition. It has a real country rock vibe to it, particularly in the guitar solo, and feels at home in the late 60s, early 70s time period in which it was written and recorded. Lyrically, the song feels closer to a dance song, with some New York City location references and fun quirky word choice throughout. Whilst the sum of these parts isn't Steely Dan, it is thoroughly enjoyable, and a great place to start this delve into the bulk of these demos. This is also one of the tracks where an alternate version has surfaced, appearing on what is known as the Knuckle Sandwich reel. This take is slightly longer and in a slower tempo, and I can only assume is performed by the same band as the first, as the vocals still sound like Keith Thomas. It's hard to decide which version I prefer, as unfortunately the Knuckle Sandwich reel is in poorer quality than the other recording, and it doesn't really offer a whole lot, which makes it worth going out of the way to hear unless you are a true Steely Dan obsessive. I was worried that my assessment of A Horse in Town not being especially Steely Dan-esque was purely based on Fagen not being on vocals. However, this song does have Fagen on vocals, and I feel the same way. In the verses it definitely feels not too distant from a Dan track, but the chorus feels perceptibly different in a way I can't quite place. Once again though, it being different isn't a complaint in and of itself. The song is much simpler recording, featuring just Fagen on vocals and keys with Becker and Kenny Vance backing him up vocally. Musically too, it's a fairly straightforward track as far as Fagen and Becker go, but I do like the interplay between the vocals and the overall tune. Lyrically, it seems almost too obvious to suggest that the sugar in question might not actually be sugar, but this is early days. Maybe Fagen and Becker weren't masters at sneaky drug references just yet. Although underdeveloped, it definitely has that sort of novelistic quality that Dan lyrics tend to have, and like with those, I am always interested to hear other people's interpretations. This is the first of these tracks that I think wouldn't have felt out of place on a Steely Dan record, albeit one of their more eclectic earlier ones, and accordingly it's probably my favourite so far. It's a simple recording, Fagen on keys and vocals, Kenny Vance on drums, and whilst it isn't the best performance, it's a very catchy track with some classic Fagen singing. Becker also joins in during the chorus on backing vocals, as if this song weren't good enough already. While I do really like the verses and chorus, I do not care so much for the passages where they repeat the line, "that you're alive," which breaks up the flow of the song in a way that really irritates me. They don't last very long though, so it doesn't spoil the song for me even if it is a bit annoying. Lyrically, the song again has a real half-complete story feel. It could be about anything, from a fraud war hero to a neat little foray into Fagen and Becker's love for sci-fi, or even, as suggested by respected lyrical analyst Mike D9841 on YouTube, an analogy for our school system. The Android warehouse is school. Wise words. Also, quick PSA, this track apparently gets mixed up with the demo of Caves of Altamira on many of the lesser bootlegs, so look out for that if you haven't heard these before. This is another really good one, albeit very weird. I had actually heard this one before, though I can't remember why, but I liked it then and I like it now. The lead vocals are actually shared by Fagen and Becker on this one, singing a duet, and the effect works really well as their vocals complement each other nicely in this instance. The whole band, completed by DiCepolo and DS, are really solid and give a great performance. The lyrics strike me as a fun pastiche of the novelty dance songs of the late 50s and early 60s, but other interpretations seem to revolve around LSD, and I can definitely see that too. This is another track with an alternate take found on the Knuckle Sandwich reel, where it sounds to me like it is primarily Becker and Thomas singing. Like the Horse in Town alternate take, I think its lower quality is definitely a hindrance, but I think in this case I definitely prefer the original anyway. This version has some hand claps though, so that's cool. This song breaks the streak we had going of demos I really like, but A, it was only a streak of 2, B, I ordered these songs alphabetically so it was a fake streak to begin with, and C, I still like this song. That being said, it starts a new streak going, as this song also features a lead vocal duet between Fagen and Becker, and it definitely makes me wonder why they never tried it out on a Dan track, as their voices actually work quite well together. Aside from the trio of Fagen, Becker and DS, the song also features a drummer called John Mazzy, who again doesn't seem to have had a huge career in music outside of a few other tracks in this video. The song itself is a pretty standard number by Fagen and Becker standards, with a kind of blues R&B pop feel. The lyrics match the music, with a mostly conventional love song type feel with that bluesy or soulful tinge. Some of these demos definitely demonstrate Fagen and Becker's developing maturity as songwriters more than others, as songs like this feel more like them trying to write a hit than a song in their own unique style. But it's still far from bad, and some nice slick guitar playing by DS alongside the Fagen-Becker vocals definitely elevates it. Weirdly, this song starts another obscure and totally random streak in that it's coincidentally one of the few other tracks to feature John Mazzy, which is a fun piece of pre-Dan history all on its own. Alongside him are Diaz and Vance on guitar and backing vocals respectively. The verses feature some distinctly Dan-esque chords and a classic Fagen vocal performance that already feels very familiar, especially when paired with a bluesy chorus that evokes pretzel logic or chain lightning. Indeed, this track is perhaps the most Steely Dan sounding of all so far. I could absolutely see this on Pretzel Logic or Katie Lied with barely any changes. Most of the depth is with the music, as the lyrics are a fairly standard bluesy love song affair, but the music definitely does enough to carry it and the lyrics play the role they need to. This is one of the demos that not only shows you the evolution of their sound, but also feels as if it would not be out of place among some of their later work. Not the most interesting composition of these demos, but there's still some cool stuff in here. In terms of cool obscure Dan lore and history, this song has it in spades, featuring not only Mazzy on drums for the third and final time on one of these demos, but also a Fagen-Becker lead vocal duet and, bizarrely, Fagen on saxophone. While it's cool to hear some horns on these demos for once, I think it was a good idea for them to let the professionals do it when it came time to record actual albums. Denny Diaz also appears on guitar, but despite some cool trivia, this definitely has more of a Dan in progress feel in comparison to some of the other demos. This is fair enough, of course, and with some work I could see the song being developed into something more interesting, but for the most part I find it largely unremarkable. The protagonist is like a parody of a Steely Dan character, a total loser with no prospects or life who is seemingly proud of this fact. He also tells us he drinks his dinner from a paper sack, a line which would eventually be recycled on the Katie Lied track Daddy Don't Live in That New York City No More. Perhaps this is a prequel to that song, taking place before he had Lucy. But really, all that matters is that Becker sings co-vocals on this track. Instant 10 out of 10. How many times can I make that fucking joke? Hey, I got a joke. What was the name of Stagger Lee's unemployed brother? Ida Lee? Anyway, this is a very chill little tune, with a simple Fagen, Becker, Vance band. It's almost too chill, as I feel even accounting for the stripped back setup of a demo, it's a bit sparse on the musical front to really grab me. It's charming in its simplicity, but it's definitely not one of my favourite demos so far. Lyrically, it almost reads to me like a first draft of Josie, not least because of the line referencing Hooters and the Hats. It also just has the same general vibe. A party is being thrown for someone, and in the world of Fagen and Becker, I can only see that as being a celebration of someone getting out of jail. Other than that, I haven't got much else to say. I was kinda counting on the stag lead joke pulling me through there. Another quite bluesy number here, with Keith Thomas on lead vocals again. The band here is a familiar one. Fagen, Becker, Diaz and DeCepolo all give a tight performance. Once again I am reminded of Pretzel Logic or Chain Lightning, perhaps even more so this time, which I certainly don't mind at all. Thomas's vocals are good at bringing a sense of grandeur and scale, as he has an impressive vocal range and is all around a great addition to the demos he features on. The lyrics are also pretty cool, very esoteric and quirky. There is also a mention of a juggernaut at a door, and whilst I couldn't tell you what that means, I do know that Fagen and Becker seem to quite like it as a phrase, as it eventually got adapted into a line on the later outtake The Bear. I might not be a great lyrical critic, but I sure know how to point out extremely niche Steely Dan trivia. So this is a musical adaptation of a song recited in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, set to a 60s pop rock backing track with Walter Becker singing on lead vocals. As you can imagine then, this is an exceptionally bizarre song, not just for Fagen and Becker's standards, but just in general. It's pretty fun and catchy in an ironically corny way, but in terms of how strange it is, it almost feels like their equivalent of David Bowie's The Laughing Gnome, albeit quite a bit nicer to listen to. Songs like this are definitely where I can see the oddball Mothers of Invention influence creeping in, as it has definitely got that sort of feel. For all its weirdness by virtue of rarity, Becker's lead vocal performance is really quite good, and it astounds me that it took until 2003 for him to be given an official lead vocal job on a Steely Dan album. As far as these demos go, you would be hard pressed to find a weirder song than this. I'm telling you now actually, this is as weird as it gets. I'm not sure exactly what Fagen and Becker are channeling here, but I'm not really digging it. It feels like the precursor to some of the weirder, more off-the-wall tracks they played around with on Pretzel Logic, but whilst I find those songs charming in their weirdness even when they don't fully work for me, I find this one rather grating. Whilst the Mock Turtle song was a pretty successful attempt at creating a bizarre Zappa-esque sort of style, this song strikes me as a bit more of a failed experiment in pursuit of the same goal. It's rather obtuse and impenetrable, not being overtly avant-garde as it maintains a poppy structure and general vibe, but also lacking a catchy melody or clear point of entry for the listener. As much as I do want to praise this song for having Becker on backing vocals, the high-pitch harmonies do wear on me a bit, and they definitely don't help the already difficult song become any easier. If anything, they are the main culprit to blame for this fact. Lyrically, it's a bit cooler, with the major point of note being a reference to William Burroughs, and I don't think I need to spell out the Steely Dan connection there. I hope not anyway. I don't want this video I won't make any money on to get demonetized. A change of pace from the fairly bizarre previous two tracks, this song tips a bit too far in the other direction. It's a fairly conventional piano-driven ballad with suitably standard love song lyrics to go with it. The song isn't a failure at what it attempts to do, but it just feels weird to hear a genuine Fagen Becker ballad without any real sense of irony or sarcasm. They can do earnest, and they don't do it badly, but it always leaves me with the impression that they are uncomfortable doing it, and I am not much more comfortable listening. It is a shame that the band formed by Fagen and Becker's joining of Demian never really got a chance to shine outside of these demos. It is a very different vibe to Steely Dan, but the sound they were developing is really fun to listen to. That being said, this one is probably the one that comes closest to sounding Dan-esque, at least to my ears. I put this down to two things. The first being a chorus where Fagen takes the lead briefly, which for obvious reasons sounds more familiar than Thomas's vocals.
Walter, put your dick away, Walter.
And secondly, while the two songs don't sound particularly similar, the theme and overall tone of the song reminds me of Change of the Guard from Can't Buy a Thrill. Not just because it is about some sort of shift or change in government, but the decision to pair this with a cheery piano pop backdrop. Overall, it has some great performances from every player, a catchy tune, and a unique feel and style that you won't find at any other point in the history of Fagen and Becker's work. This is also the final song with an alternate take on the knuckle sandwich reel, and like before, the lower quality means it's more of a fun insight than a genuine alternative to the main version. Despite this, it's got a cool time change at the end, so it's definitely worth a look. I don't know if it's just a coincidence or simply an observation driven by lack of comparison, but I usually find that the songs, like this one, that are given more stripped back demos, are often the ones best suited to it. The only problem with these simpler tracks is that I have less interesting or noteworthy stuff to point to, and there are only so many ways I can say I think a song is good. I can't really offer any theories on the lyrics myself, but the references to numerous characters and locations in a rather esoteric, unconventional narrative is yet another that demonstrates Fagen and Becker's ability to craft mini-novels in their songs that are open to many interpretations. This is also one of the songs that Fagen and Becker managed to sell on to another artist, but I'll cover that soon enough. Another track I really dig, although I had heard this one already. It's a breezy 2-minute tune, but there's a lot to like about it. I especially dig the descending chords leading into the chorus. Thomas delivers a really delicate performance on this song that really demonstrates his talents as a vocalist, and is probably my favourite of his lead vocals on these songs. I'm not as keen on the chorus as I am on the verses, but between them and the cool brief instrumental breakdown in the middle, I really enjoy this song as a whole, even if I'm cooler on some parts than I am on others. Lyrically, it's also pretty strange, like a lot of these demos, and once again I am personally at a loss when it comes to offering a theory on what they're about. I mean, they even reference something called Steely Dan. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I listened to this one a couple of times over to get a feel for it, and it definitely grew on me. At first I wasn't hugely grabbed by it, but after another listen or two I actually grew to quite like it. Although Fagen can never truly not sound like Fagen, his vocals on this song are pretty unique. Despite this, I could definitely see this song on an album like Pretzel Logic with some reworking. I feel the austere nature of demos hurts this one slightly, as I could see a complete band rendition with more going on really bringing this track to life. I also personally find it a little too low tempo, and I think the song would sound better if it were played more upbeat. Luckily, there actually exists an upbeat version of this song in the form of an alternate take, which I personally prefer to the normal one. And when I return to this demo in future, I'll probably listen to this version over the regular one. I take back what I said on the last song about Fagen not being able to sound like Fagen, as his vocals on this song totally floored me when I first heard it. Although musically this is another relatively simple piano ballad that really doesn't do anything for me, Fagen delivers a totally unique performance that is unlike anything else he ever did. Fagen not only attempting to do a pretty piano ballad with soft vocals, but actively pulling it off, although not perfectly, is totally wild to me. There is also an alternate version with a more complete band of Fagen, Becker, DeCepolo, Thomas, and a rare Kenny Vance lead vocal performance. This version, as well as Vance's performance, is arguably more complete as a package, but it lacks the intrigue of the Fagen version. Following on in the style of Sun Mountain, Take It Out On Me is another fairly conventional piano ballad that I really don't have a lot to say about. It feels very in line with the late 60s to early 70s singer-songwriter style of pop music, and I could definitely see this being a minor hit for another artist in that genre. I do like the piano on this song. It's quite pretty and works well on its own. The song wouldn't really benefit from much more going on. As it stands, although not hugely complicated musically or lyrically, it's a cool look into Fagen and Becker's ability to write more conventional, earnest, and introspective pop material. The third fairly genuine love song in a row is also probably my favourite of the three. Despite the uniqueness of Fagen's vocals on Sun Mountain, the way this song leans even heavier into its contemporary singer-songwriter style of pop, and a bit less into the schmaltzy piano ballad, is definitely a differentiation I appreciate. It feels very Carole King-esque, especially with Fagen's piano line and the folky guitar touches from Becker. It's easy as a Steely Dan fan to write off more conventional pop, and this isn't the most expertly crafted example of it anyhow, but writing a catchy pop tune does actually take a lot of skill, and it's cool to see a younger Fagen and Becker demonstrate a very clear talent for doing so. In another universe, Fagen and Becker definitely could have made it as writers at the Brill Building. I'm glad I live in this universe instead, but it's cool we get these little insights into others too. This is the last from the Demian era of demos on this list, and whilst it isn't my favourite, it's also the one that reminds me most of what was to come. It's got much more of a country rock feel, but the piano especially reminds me of an early Dan track. We also get some cool guitar playing from Diaz, and all around the band feels pretty coherent and tight. Lyrically it's a bit more simplistic. It seems to be about someone who's undecided, which at the very least is not false advertising. Indeed, for a track from an era of the duo's work that both feel decidedly split halfway between Steely Dan and an entirely different, although still quite cool, type of music, the title Undecided feels apt in more ways than one. The final track found on the Knuckle Sandwich reel was this 6-minute instrumental jam, which might just be one of the coolest things in this whole video. At the very least, it's one of the most unique. Some people have said it feels like an early iteration of what would slowly morph into Your Gold Teeth from Countdown to Ecstasy, and I can definitely see that comparison coming through in places. It also definitely feels like it's drawing on Zappa again as an influence. Whilst I couldn't find out who's playing on this jam, I have to imagine it's from the Demian era of the band, but regardless of who is playing, everyone gives a killer performance. Much like Your Gold Teeth, Fagen, assuming it is Fagen, gets a fairly rare chance to show off his chops as a player, and his keyboard is definitely my favourite part of this track. All of these songs provide an awesome insight into the first 5 years of Fagen and Becker's partnership, but this song's raw improvisational nature does so in an entirely unique way. Also, because of its relative obscurity even as far as these rarities go, I suspect there's a good chunk of even hardcore Dan fans who have never heard this track. I highly encourage anyone who hasn't to check it out. Sadly, like the rest of the reel, the quality isn't great, and I do hope that a cleaner version eventually surfaces or gets put together. This is another one, like Stone Piano, which I was a bit indifferent towards on my first listen, but which grew on me as I went back over the songs to nail down my thoughts on them. In fact, this one went up even more on a re-listen than Stone Piano did, as it's now probably among my favourites in the whole list. Musically and lyrically, this is a really cool song that I could definitely see on a Dan album, and even with the limited Fagen-Becker-Vance arrangement, it still has a really cool sense of scale and drama to it that is similar to what I get from songs like The Royal Scam or Home at Last. I really love the piano on this track, and Fagen delivers a really solid and relatively unique vocal performance. The drama suits the lyrics quite well too, as this is a classic Fagen and Becker novel in a song, where tons of characters, name drops of faraway locations, and a sense of some vague era in history combine to give you just enough of a story for you to fill in the gaps by yourself. There's even a reference to a character called Josie, which further cements the lyrics as having a very Dan-esque feel to them. Not a lot of Dan songs go for this sense of scale, but it definitely evokes the spirit of the few that do. To round out this collection of demos is You Go Where I Go, which features just Fagen alone at his keyboard. Both lyrically and musically, this is another fairly conventional pop love song. It isn't a simple retread of the other demos of its kind, though, as it draws on other influences that set it apart from the piano ballads and folky singer-songwriter influences of other demos similar to it. I have seen people draw parallels between this and songs written by people like Burt Bacharach, and I definitely get that sort of feel from it too. It's not my favourite of the demos by any means, but it does feel appropriate to end on, as a nice, relaxing coda at the end of a varied, fascinating collection of songs. And with that concludes what is, as far as I'm aware, the full collection of pre-Dan demos. For the most part, I had never listened to these songs before, and the songs I had heard I was still hardly familiar with. It would be rare for me to give an overview or opinion in this series that isn't informed by a literal lifetime of listening to the songs in question, but I'm glad that putting together this video finally made me get around to giving these a chance. It is a decision I'm very glad I made, as I found something to appreciate in nearly all the tracks. These demos, as I outlined before, were created across a fairly large space of time and under a variety of different circumstances, and so it's difficult to make sweeping claims about Fagen and Becker's sophistication as songwriters at the time, or what they can tell us about the era as a nebulous blob of 5 years of work. It's not as if each track here feels like a distinct piece of a puzzle that it took 5 years to put together and then, once done, Steely Dan appeared fully fledged. Many of these tracks vary wildly, from gentle piano ballads to off-the-wall Zappa-esque experiments, and outside of minor details, it's hard to claim they laid the foundation for the musical and lyrical style of what Fagen and Becker would spend the next several decades exploring. This isn't a negative or a diss on these demos, as beyond the fact it is unreasonable to expect a pair of freshly graduated college kids to produce demos that instantly sound like a track from Asia, it is also not a negative that they don't. Whilst it isn't the case that none of these songs sound anything like Steely Dan, some of them really do, and a few more literally are. These demos aren't interesting or unique because of this fact. These demos are unique because they show us Dan fans a time when Fagen and Becker were still trying things out. Of course not all of these experiments were fully realised or immensely engaging, but figuring out what you don't want to do and what doesn't work is as important as figuring out what you do and what does. And this is all before we get to the fact that a lot of these songs are quite good. I'm not going to be all contrarian here and say I like any of these demos more than I like anything they did as Steely Dan, because that isn't true. But like I said, to expect anything like that is unreasonable. And frankly, if I compared everything I listened to Steely Dan, I would end up never listening to anything but Steely Dan. These tracks are all interesting in their own way, musically as well as historically, and I am extremely glad we have as many of them as we do. I won't do a full ranking, at least not yet, but if I had to pick some favourites, I would go for Android Warehouse, the Braintap Shuffle, Don't Let Me In, Soul Ram, Untitled Instrumental Jam, and Yellow Peril. Whilst I assume the majority of people watching this video have already heard these songs, and a good chunk would be more familiar with them than I am, I really do implore you to take a look if you haven't, and maybe a re-listen if you have but didn't click with them. They aren't perfect, they aren't Steely Dan quality, and they are certainly not a good introduction to the work of Fagen and Becker, but they are unique, fascinating, charming, and fun. But this is not everything that the pre-Dan era has to offer. Far from it, in fact, as we haven't even addressed the fact that Fagen and Becker had already made an officially released album that they wrote and played on alongside the other members of Demian a whole year before they became Steely Dan. So, let's talk about that. You Gotta Walk It Like You Talk It or You'll Lose That Beat is a 1971 comedy film directed by Peter Locke and starring Robert Downey Sr. and, in a minor role, a young Richard Pryor. I could tell you more about this movie, but really, who cares? Well, I know for sure who didn't care. Literally every single person to ever have been remotely involved with this movie, and that includes the people who saw it. As a result, the film is now completely lost media, to the point that the poster image on Wikipedia is that of the soundtrack album. As I'm sure you either know or have intuited, said soundtrack album is the point of interest here, as for whatever reason it has survived. Fagen and Becker have writing credits on most of the songs, and alongside Diaz, DiCepolo, Vance and his fellow Jay and the Americans member Marty Coopersmith, perform on most of them as well. Unlike the demos, I have already heard this album. However, I have still only heard it once and am eager to re-listen as I have all but forgotten basically everything. This video is already long enough as is, so without further ado let's jump into the tracks. This song actually has a pretty cool groove, and despite the keyboard touches sounding very outdated and gimmicky, I do actually like the vaguely funky flavour they add. I can't quite decide on what they are meant to be, but my best guess is some early 70s attempt at emulating an organ. But my god, Coopersmith's lead vocals are a total throw-off. I can't speak to him as a vocalist in general, because I haven't heard anything by Jay and the Americans, and this being a comedy movie soundtrack means he could well be doing it for a silly factor rather than a normal vocal performance, but it sounds like someone doing a shitty Randy Newman impersonation. Not a fan at all. The fact Fagen and Becker share a writing credit with the director on this one makes me think he told Coopersmith to sing like that, because if the reviews of this movie are any indication, it definitely seems like the sort of shit he'd find funny. I do like Coopersmith's little riff it on me Donald ad-lib though. Pop music needs more vocal ad-libs. All in all, this is a very weird intro to the soundtrack, and I'm surprised it didn't stick in my memory more. Well, it seems like they got an actual organ for this track, so there goes my theory. Anyway, the lack of vocals on this one, if the style from the first song is to continue, definitely do this track a big favour. Fagen and Becker share writing credits with Vance on this really cool bluesy jam with a surprisingly heavy sound and some vaguely psychedelic touches, especially in the panning of Diaz's guitar, which is a cool effect but a tad overdone to the point it becomes a bit jarring. Nonetheless, this track is a really big step up from the totally bizarre opener, and I can imagine it working well as a film score too, if given the right scene. This 90-second drum solo interspersed with Fagen smashing his keys on the piano over the top is, in all likelihood, the only writing credit John DiCepolo ever got in music, and it really goes to show that the old adage of something being better than nothing is not always true. I struggle to think what use this cacophony of noise really has in any capacity, let alone in scoring a film, but at the very least it has the good decency to be over quickly. Vance's smooth lead vocals lend themselves well to this very breezy track that draws on elements of country rock in what almost feels proto-yacht rock adjacent, but for its lack of the word fool. Another cool fact is that Fagen's then girlfriend Dorothy White has partial writing credits on this song, alongside Fagen and Becker, though I'm not sure exactly what she contributed. This does mean that there are 2 officially released Fagen compositions where his then partner is given partial writing credits. I'm not sure what mood the director of this film was attempting to go for, as so far all these tracks have been quite different, but then again, who am I to question the brain of a man who has directed 860 episodes of Divorce Court? About 20 seconds of actual music followed by some funny sound effects and something about tomatoes. What do you even want me to say here? The first solely Fagen-Becker written track on this album, and also the first with Fagen on lead vocals. This is a pretty fun up-tempo track with a vaguely bluesy feel and a solid driving groove. Fagen's vocals are still underdeveloped in comparison to Thrill only a year later, but his performance is relatively solid. Once again, it seems like a tonal shift from everything that preceded it, but wondering how on earth these were all supposed to fit into an 85-minute film doesn't spoil my enjoyment of the better tracks on this album. Fagen and Becker share the writing credits with Vance again on this almost 8-minute jam, which is probably a bit longer than it would need to be on a regular album, but which is still enjoyable. So far, this is definitely the one I can most see as fitting on a film score, as its more simplistic jam nature lends itself better to a background music role. Diaz is the clear standout, as the rest of the band basically just lay down a groove for him to riff on, and whilst the bluesy licks aren't anything you wouldn't get anywhere else, they make for a pretty cool 8 minutes. The closer to the soundtrack is also the second solely Fagen-Becker writing credit, and it is a pretty conventional schmaltzy film outro track that feels distinctly unearned in its sincerity, following a 7-track odyssey of varying genres and silliness desperately attempting to be funny. Vance's vocals suit the song well, as his mellow and gentle voice is definitely more suited to earnest ballad-type tracks than Fagen's, and certainly more than whatever the fuck Coopersmith was doing on the title track. About halfway through, the drums kick in, and the song builds some more momentum, but it's not enough to really make this song anything special. And with that comes the end of the soundtrack of You Gotta Walk It Like You Talk It or You'll Lose That Beat. Much like what we can gather about the film it accompanied, it's a bit all over the place, a bit messy, a bit unsure of what it wants to be. But in 3 key ways it manages to elevate itself above the finer details of its imperfections or the failure of the movie it was recorded for. Firstly, it being a soundtrack means it potentially had a lot of external influence or requirements that means any seemingly tasteless or bizarre decisions can easily be deflected from the band, and are so short-lived that even if they weren't, are not truly enough to be genuinely annoying. Secondly, it has some genuinely good moments, and with the exception of the title tracks and War and Peace, I enjoyed every song on its own to varying levels. And thirdly, unlike the movie it accompanied, the soundtrack was considered worthwhile enough artistically or historically to preserve, and is to this day the only remnant of the film that survives. On this last point, it is, much like the rest of the demos, of great historical interest to Dan fans. And whilst it is far from perfect, its status as the only official recording of Fagen-Becker anywhere before Steely Dan was formed makes it a must-listen for any Dan fan. So at last we reach the final part of the pre-Dan years, the songs Fagen and Becker wrote but were performed by others. This can include covers, but more importantly it can be songs written specifically for other artists, or which otherwise found their way to them without a Fagen-Becker recording existing or surfacing. In this era, seeing as Fagen and Becker hadn't actually recorded anything officially themselves except the soundtrack, this section is entirely comprised of the latter. Finally, a lot of these songs, especially from this era, do have Fagen-Becker recordings that are known or rumoured to exist, so I once again implore you to check out the spreadsheet of missing Dan tracks I included in the description. Unlikely as it is, nothing would bring me more happiness with this series than a freak case of someone discovering it and realising they have a tape that has been searched for in the community for decades. With that all out of the way, and for the final time in this video, let's jump into the music. Undoubtedly Fagen and Becker's biggest foray into the world of staff songwriting is Linda Hoover's 1970 debut record I Mean to Shine. And yet, until 2022, a legal dispute over the album's release had stopped it ever surfacing. Luckily for us, Hoover managed to get it released, and with it a major piece of pre-Dan history was uncovered. The album's Dan history isn't limited to Fagen and Becker, as it was also produced by Gary Katz and featured Jeff Baxter among others. But most important is the 5 Fagen and Becker compositions: I Mean to Shine, Turn My Friend Away, Roaring of the Lamb, Roll Back the Meaning, and Jones. So let's look at these one by one. Fagen and Becker's first contribution to the album is the opening title track, and it's an interesting one. In many ways, it feels wholly unrecognisable as a Fagen and Becker composition. It's lyrically bereft of irony, musically bordering on saccharine, and although there are horns, they feel closer to the band than Asia. Hoover even covers In a Station later on. None of this is bad, of course. In fact, I actually rather like this song on that level alone. But it is also not true to say there is nothing recognisable in this track at all. For a start, the inclusion of horns at all is an anomaly in the pre-Thrill years, and represents Fagen and Becker developing a more sophisticated instrumental palette. Comparisons to the band are far from an insult, but also interesting to me is my review for Dirty Work, which I wrote before this video, made a similar comparison, and the two songs even share a saxophonist in Jerome Richardson. Indeed, with the exception of Hoover and DiCepolo, the 4 remaining players form half a Thrill track by themselves. On the whole, it is a relatively conventional 70s soft rock tune, with some cool Dan-esque tinges for more observant listeners. Even in spite of these, the writing and performances here are enough to let the song stand on its own, and sets the mood of the album very effectively. When Hoover's record was shelved, this track received a recording by Barbra Streisand the following year, which can only have added insult to injury. Although the album was a moderate hit for Streisand, I would argue that time has vindicated Hoover here, as I vastly prefer her recording. Streisand's rendition is fine, but manages to feel less complete even with a far larger instrumental backing, bordering on Wall of Sound territory. Beyond the historical value, also of note to Dan fans is the appearance of Fagen, along with frequent future collaborator Hugh McCracken on acoustic guitar. Very much a continuation of the style established in the last track, except for one piece of highly unique Dan history. As per the credits on YouTube, this was not written by Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, but instead by Becker and Donald's secret evil sibling Donad Fagen, his only writing credit until John Cone on Gaucho. Other than this, Turn My Friend Away continues on in the same vein as I Mean to Shine. It's instrumentally a little more stripped back, mainly driven by an acoustic guitar with some occasional flute touches. Although I think there is less in the way of notable Becker and Faganisms, what takes their place is far from bad, even if it doesn't really grab my attention. Donald sits this one out again, as Becker wrote this one with his other brother, Walter Fagen, who unfortunately died shortly afterwards in a bizarre gardening accident. Outside of this trivia, there isn't much to say here that I didn't already say about this song in its demo form. Whilst the demo's simplicity didn't really impact my enjoyment of it, I definitely think this completed iteration is the best version of the track. The string and horn arrangements are sparse, but used very effectively to bring a necessary sense of drama. Although we have evidence otherwise, Roaring of the Lamb fits so nicely into this album that it would be very easy to assume it was written for it. Much like Roaring of the Lamb, Fagen and Becker themselves recorded this track, this time for the previously discussed soundtrack. Skunk plays on this track and delivers a performance that leaves little doubt as to why Fagen and Becker eventually began working with him again. Other than this, however, I can't think of anything to add about this track. The final Fagen and Becker contribution to the album is Jones, which Becker seemingly had some affection for as he eventually covered it live, but I will get into that in a future video. I can see what Becker liked about it too. It is perhaps the most overtly country rock driven of the 5 songs, but it is a genre that Fagen and Becker are very comfortable within and will continue to incorporate for many years to come, albeit with a bit more subtlety. Similarly, the lyrics really don't leave much to the imagination. It's hardly Dr. Wu when it comes to nuanced drug narratives. Even still, neither of these elements are bad in their simplicity, and when coupled with another soothing vocal performance from Hoover, there is a nice sense of irony to the lyrics that I'm sure Fagen and Becker got a kick out of. There was also a live rendition of this track Hoover shared a while ago, which I meant to include, however the link appears to not work anymore. Altogether, whilst the tracks on Hoover's album are not personally hugely exciting, they are a massively overlooked piece of Dan history and display a level of cohesion in Fagen and Becker's songwriting, not only with each other, but with the other songs on the album broadly. I recommend checking the record out, even just to support Linda. She's earned it for her dedication to getting her music released. The only other artist, as far as I could tell, who recorded multiple Fagen and Becker songs is Kenny Vance. 3 songs written by the duo were included as part of Vance's pair of archival albums in 2014 and 2015, with Shuffling Up Your Downs on the first volume and American Lovers and Take a Dip with Dinah on the second. Fagen, Becker and Discepolo joined Vance on this one, which makes me wonder if a version with Fagen singing even exists. Regardless, this song wouldn't feel out of place amongst the Demian tracks, albeit with slightly better quality and more players. The song is under 2 minutes, and that combined with its pretty high tempo definitely makes it fly past. It's actually pretty catchy, and despite being a moderately shaky performance does have the foundations of a genuinely nice pop tune. American Lovers got many official covers further into the decade, as well as an actual Steely Dan performance on the Rarities Night show in 2011, all of which will be covered in due time. Unlike the last one, this track features neither Fagen nor Becker, just Vance and a pianist called Jordan Kaplan, whom I couldn't find any information about. Fagen and Becker's absence is felt, as even in the demos they usually brought some character or charm to the recordings that is lacking here. Whilst this isn't bad, it doesn't really offer anything that would make one want to listen again, especially when full recordings of this track exist. John Massey returns for one last time, and along with him come Fagen, Becker and Diaz. Much like I suspected, the more complete band and the addition of Fagen and Becker definitely brings some much needed life to this song. It does feel kind of unlike anything else in this video, almost feeling like an homage to doo-wop, but also having a very strong folk feel. Once again, I really like Vance's vocals on this one, but his performance is only part of the cozy, relaxed atmosphere of the track. The gentle acoustic guitar being used percussively is something I always love, and the raindrop-like piano is extremely comforting. Of the 3 demos, it's probably my favourite. And finally, there are a couple of songs from the pre-Dan era that got an officially released rendition by another artist. As far as I could find, the only examples of this are Canyon Ladies by Navasosha and Giles of the River by Denny Doherty. Very little information exists about Navasosha, and it seems the impact of this 1972 debut album, which was also coincidentally their last, was as close to zero as is humanly possible. That being said, they don't seem like a bad band. They are a pretty generic run-of-the-mill southern rock group, and this song isn't really any exception, even with Fagen on piano. The backing vocals are perhaps the only definitively Dan-esque element of the song, and it's no surprise to learn that 2 of them were regulars on future Dan records. There are some horns in there too, but on the whole the song is largely a standard heavy southern rock tune. This is a cool song, but of all the tracks in this video it would be among the hardest to identify as a Fagen and Becker track without knowing. Unlike Navasosha, Denny Doherty was an established artist from his work with the Mamas and the Papas through the 1960s. By 1971 he had long since gone solo, and this Fagen and Becker track found its way to him. Much like the last track, it would be hard to pick out as one of their songs, and leans into a style of country rock that isn't really my sort of music. But the backing vocals are very nice and Dan-esque, and in a video full of bootlegs and demos it is nice to hear a song with a decent level of fidelity. And with that concludes what I really fucking hope is the complete list of existing Fagen and Becker tracks from the pre-Dan years. It is such an eclectic mess that I hardly even know how to go about summarising them all, and that is hardly surprising given the fact that these were recorded at different times, under different circumstances, and sometimes by different people entirely. It's also personally difficult for me, as unlike every other video in this series, this was an almost total blind spot for me. Outside of a couple of demos, the Hoover stuff and the soundtrack, I hadn't even so much as listened to these tracks before, let alone had any sort of deep understanding of them. It would be absurd then to try and claim that there are any commonalities between these songs, because even if there were, I would not be the person to consult for answers. Instead, it's better to look at what these songs, broadly, can tell us about these early development years of Fagen and Becker's career. So, what do they tell us? Well, for a start, they tell us what Fagen and Becker were like in their formative years as songwriters. That much is obvious. And if I'm being honest, I do kind of see why they were usually so dismissive of their work from this time. This isn't to say that I don't like these tracks, far from it in fact. I was pleasantly surprised to find there was nothing here I outright disliked. At worst, there were a couple of songs that were a bit too quirky or a bit too conventional, a bit unfinished or unrealised. At best, however, there is a diverse spectrum of early experiments that showcase the brilliance of Fagen and Becker as songwriters in a way wholly unique to these tracks. This ranges from the early flashes of the Dan sound on demos like Don't Let Me In or Yellow Peril, to the fascinatingly un-Dan-esque Demian recordings. Even at their worst, these songs still have pure historical value going for them. And as such, I have to say there isn't a single song here I wouldn't recommend die-hard fans at least check out. Not all of them will demand a re-lesson, but they all have something to offer. But as I said, I do still understand Fagen and Becker's distaste for these songs. Just because they're all interesting doesn't mean they're all good, and not all of these songs are equal. Furthermore, whilst die-hard fans will always be assured of a base level enjoyment of these songs, casual fans might not be. Certain demos, alongside most of the officially released stuff with the exception of maybe a few songs on the soundtrack, are whole enough to have a relatively broad appeal. But the rougher demos will probably not get a re-listen from me anytime soon, let alone a less obsessive fan. But this is all ultimately irrelevant. The main point is that these tracks are where it all started. And as a result, I am glad I covered these pieces of the duo's history in this first episode. Not just because it motivated me to explore them for the first time, and not just because of my need to make everything follow a nicely organised linear structure, but because before you start talking about Asia or Dr. Wu or anything that came after this, you need to understand where it all came from, and how it got where it ended up. For 5 years, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker were not Steely Dan by name, and they were hardly Steely Dan by output either. But if you listen closely and pay enough attention to the work they made in that time, you start to see how they slowly but surely developed a style that drew on jazz, rock, blues, pop, and many other influences. How they mastered the art of forming tight bands that understood what was needed of them, and brought just enough of their own flair to make things interesting, and how they steadily perfected the craft of creating entire worlds filled with interesting and wholly unique characters and stories with lyrics only they could have written. And from there, you start to see how they were always Steely Dan in spirit. See you next time. Okay, so this is unscripted, this part. I'm just going to sort of speak for a bit. This is just like an outro, a wrap-up. So, first of all, thank you if you've watched this video. If in fact anyone has watched this far, I wouldn't blame you for clicking off before now. But yeah, thank you if you've stayed this long, for supporting this channel so early on in its life. Thank you to everyone who helped me out in researching this video. You all know who you are. Thank you to everyone in the community who's maintained and put out this stuff. It would have been a lot harder if I had to go digging for it. And apologies for the quality of this video. I think I bit off more than I could chew by starting out with this topic rather than going back later. But yeah, I know that some of the analysis of songs I gave here wasn't as intricate as I would have liked, but there were a lot of songs to cover, and it's very early on. But by the time we get into Can't Buy a Thrill and all of the other official Steely Dan albums that I know very personally, very deeply, I should be able to provide a bit more analysis. Yeah, I think that's everything. So, thank you, and goodbye.